Cost versus quality in cancer care, technology's role in pathway implementation, increased collaboration between payers and providers. How will providers capture and report data required by payers for clinical pathways? And how can the quality of care be sustained with less and less time available for patient visits? Join us to find out. In the Know starts now. Hello and welcome to In the Know, your source for insight and analysis on the issues that matter to specialty pharma. I'm your host, Gina Clark. Today we host the second of our two-part discussion on clinical pathways and other payer issues affecting community oncology. We'll explore the obstacles that stand in the way for pathway implementation and look at what the next year holds for cancer care from a reimbursement perspective. Joining us is Lesli Lord, Executive Director for Oncology Physician Resource and Southwest Oncology Network. She's also an expert in practice management and reimbursement issues. Thanks for being with us today, Lesli.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Lesli, from the provider's perspective, what steps can be taken to ensure pathway compliance within the practice?
Well, pathway compliance, it's a kind of a tricky point in there because you have a lot of physicians that they want to treat the way they want to treat. And it's important to get buy-in from the physician community, and that's why it's so important that it's a physician-centric model, that it's actually the physicians in that community that have developed those pathways, they've had a chance to review them, and they've been able to endorse them. So when you get the physician buy-in and from the community, when they've actually developed them, you're going to see a much more emphasis on the compliance because they are part of the solution, they are part of the process. And that's why it's so important to have them involved in that. Now, when you're looking at the actual operational compliance of it, when they're in the practice, there are many different ways that you can ensure that there's buy-in on the clinic level, where not only are your nurses, but your staffing and your billing people are all aware of that. If you have a technology component of it, then obviously you can have those pathways loaded into your EMR or any kind of technology you have in that practice. And then therefore they know that if they've got this practice, this patient coming in, this is the pathway they're following, and then this is the reimbursement for that. So that's easy to put into your patient workflow or your practice workflow, excuse me. Now, if you don't have a technology solution in there, that's a little bit more challenging, but it doesn't mean that you can't do it. It just means that you need to have that pathway built into, say, your super bill, or for those that are handling PQRI, follow a lot of the same models that you do on that. So there could be actually a workflow or a router in that patient file that shows this is the pathway, this is the payer, and this is how it's worked. So it just has to be built into that workflow for that patient and for that provider, but it can be done. And you want to make sure that you set the compliance at a reasonable level. You don't want to have a compliance to a pathway at 95%, because then you're setting yourself up for failure. And you also want to make sure that in every single pathway you have clinical trials included in that. So if a patient does have a clinical trial, they're pulled from any kind of analysis to be able to calculate what that is.
What are some common causes for significant deviation from established pathways, and what effect can this have on the practice?
Well, you need to take those into account when you're looking at your compliance, and you need to make sure that you have a reconciliation process in place, and that reconciliation process removes then those outliers from your calculation. The clinical trials that we talked about a couple of minutes ago, that was really important. You want to make sure that all patients that can qualify for clinical trials don't affect your compliance levels. Also, if you have a reconciliation process in place where you can identify why a patient wasn't on that pathway, if they can show the evidence and the data supporting why it shouldn't have been in the initial pathway, then that patient can be pulled from their calculations as well. So there are ways that you can set up your physician for success to be able to be compliant with that. And another tool to be able to do that, or a strategy, is in the beginning, set your compliance a little bit lower. Instead of setting at 85% to start at 75% compliance. And then after 3 months or 6 months, bumping up as you go along. And then that way you're setting yourself up for success for your calculations on this.
You know, quality of care comes up quite a bit in the discussion around clinical pathways. How do providers and payers balance the quality versus cost discussion as they move forward with pathway development?
Well, quality is that elusive, who can define what that quality is? Because obviously a payer has a different idea of what quality is than maybe your provider has. So when you look at that, the good thing about these pathways is they're all evidence-based. You have something backing up as to why you're doing what you're doing. And by standardizing your care, that's going to decrease the errors. It's going to hopefully decrease the hospitalization rates because your errors aren't going to be there. We find that if you have a standardization process in place. So quality is going to be improved, obviously, if you can keep those patients out of the hospital. And then also if you have a process in place that these pathways identify, then it keeps everybody kind of moving in the same process. And then when they reach that end point, whether that's end-of-life care or a different line of treatment, then regardless of who that physician is, they have a path to be able to follow. And that's very helpful for the payers because then they can identify, again, that variability. And if they can predict the variability, then they can somehow manage what their costs are going to be. And then the same on the side for the physicians. It's nice to be able to know how you're going to be treating 80 to 90% of your patients. That can affect you dramatically when you're doing your contracting with your manufacturers, when you're looking at obviously your par levels, when you're ordering product. And so it all around, it makes good business sense, but then also it brings it back to the quality of reducing those errors, reducing hospitalization, and ultimately keeping a real more steady cost for that patient care, which is obviously very helpful for the patient.
Does this line of thinking extend to the controversial issue of end-of-life care as well?
It does, and that's the end-of-life care is the holy grail almost between the payers and also for the providers, because it's a very difficult situation. Most of our providers that I work with, they're not comfortable with the end-of-life issue either. They want to continue to fight for that patient. And when you look at the end-of-life care, that really brings us back to that medical home concept. And you see a lot of medical home in the primary care market. But what we're trying to do in our different markets is to develop an oncology medical home. And that includes your end-of-life care. So if you can incorporate pathways, technology, end-of-life care, and then obviously the reporting aspect of it, then you can make a strong case to that payer that that patient belongs with the oncologist and it doesn't need to be with a primary care doctor. And if we can do that, then we can negotiate more opportunities of case management fees to be able to handle that. We can look at the data on how it's treated, and I think then you have a better opportunity to make that case. Right now, we can't make the case because we don't have the data backing us up. But the ultimate goal, these pathways, is that first step to get us to that end goal of that medical home for that oncology patient.